So the question is, why do we suffer? Why do we suffer? That's the question. Why do we suffer? So we suffer because, firstly, we choose to continue identifying ourselves incorrectly. Right, so instead of realizing and understanding that we are not the flesh, we continue identifying ourselves with the flesh. So that causes us to remain carnally minded. Carnally minded means we are concerned about the matters and the things of the flesh. And there's a writer that wrote, to be carnally minded is death. To be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and is peace. Right, so basically what this means is, if we continue identifying ourselves incorrectly, we will continue to suffer. But if we realize that we are not the flesh but the spirit, or the life that is in the flesh, then we can attain life and we can attain peace. That is then why it is possible to be eternal, because we are eternal beings if you just learn to separate yourselves from the flesh. Right, so here's an example. As a human, right, when you drive a car, and whilst you drive, somebody comes with that car and they knock your car from behind. Right, in that very instance you have two options. You can either and these options influence how you're going to react when you step out of the car. You can either understand that you are not the car, therefore you were not bound, right? But the car was bound. Therefore you are able to step out of the car and discuss the situation, focusing on the car that was bound and not you, right? But some people identify themselves with the car so much that even a single scratch on the car changes their mood, because they just can't separate themselves from the car. In other words, when they see the car, they see themselves. You know what I'm saying? So it is like that in a sense, that we continue to identify ourselves with the flesh. Therefore, when the flesh suffers what the flesh must suffer, we suffer with it, because we do not want to understand that we are not the flesh but the life that is in the flesh, right? Therefore, by not separating ourselves from the flesh, therefore we suffer when the flesh suffers. But when we live lives as beings who understand and knowing who we are, that we are not the flesh, therefore we are able to understand that whatever happens to the flesh firstly happens because it has to happen, right? Because that is just how nature is. Things happen because they have to happen. You know, there are a lot of forces that are moving all around, you know, and when forces affect certain things, that causes many other reactions. Therefore, things happen the way they happen because they have to happen. You know what I mean? So if we understand that we are not the flesh, we are able to separate the events of the flesh from us, right? Matter of fact, nothing can touch us. There was once a man who was hung on a cross, right? Looking at them hanging, their body, right? The man was not affected that he could just take himself to these people to hang him on the cross, because he knew that he was not the flesh. Whatever they were going to do to the flesh, they were not going to do to him, because it's impossible for them to do anything to him, right, or her, or it, you know what I mean? Because he understood that he was spirit, that he was creation itself, you know what I'm saying? He was bigger than just the flesh. So we suffer because we are failing to separate ourselves from the flesh. We suffer because we continue to identify ourselves as the flesh, and therefore there is no difference. All the events that take place in the flesh, we'll let them be, right? We'll let them affect who we are, when in essence that is not even supposed to be possible, but we make it possible because we continue identifying ourselves with the flesh. So here's the thing, I'm not saying if you cut the flesh, your arm, that you must not be concerned or you must not do anything about it. That's the difference. You see, if you are living your life spiritually minded, if you're living your life conscious, right, in consciousness, what people do, people who are carnally minded, people who identify themselves as the flesh, what they do is, when they get a cut on the arm, right, instead of dealing with the cut, they suffering the reason they have the cut. That why did it have to be me who got the cut? I just don't understand, why me? Right, so they don't deal with the events, the actual events, but they focus on other things. So they are suffering from denial, so they just can't accept that it is their arm that got cut, right? They just cannot accept it, right? That my arm was cut. They struggle with the fact that their arm was cut, instead of focusing on, okay, the arm was cut, therefore let me apply whatever I need to apply to make sure that the body feels better, you know what I mean? That is not the focus. The focus is, why is it happening to me? Right, the failure to accept the situation and then deal with the situation, right, which is the case in many instances, right? So if I go back to the example I made earlier of a guy driving a car, when your car is bumped, if you identify yourself as the flesh, right, you don't want to accept that the car was bumped. You suffer because you start thinking, oh man, I shouldn't have been there, you know, I should have been somewhere else, you know. Had I have not been there, my car would still be fine, right? So instead of dealing with the fact that the car was bumped, what do I do right now to make sure that I move on to the next stage? You get stuck on, but why? Man, why was I there at the time this thing happened? Why? Right? So that is all the cause of suffering, failure to accept. And failure to accept the situation is caused by you identifying yourself with the flesh. And if you identify yourself with the flesh, therefore you refuse to understand that, listen, the things that are happening are the things that are supposed to be happening. Right, if you look at a tree is much more wiser and much more intelligent than a lot of people, right? Because a tree is just there, right? A tree would just be there and it would be standing, and the sun would be so hot, right? But the tree would not be complaining that, why am I here when the sun is so hot, right? The next day a storm would come, and the tree would still be there experiencing the storm, and one day somebody would come and chop the tree down, and the tree would just be choppable, you know, because the tree is understanding that whatever has to happen will happen, right? It does not matter what the situation or the circumstances. The tree is much more enlightened, if I may say so myself. You know, the tree understands the oneness, the greatness, that it cannot disappear, right? It cannot disappear The tree will always be here. It cannot disappear. You can chop it down, but when you chop it down, all you are doing is you will be converting it from being in this form to something else. Somebody can say, yeah, but I can take the tree and go burn it, right? You can take the tree and burn it, but when you burn it, you're just only converting it to ash, right? It just cannot disappear, because all that is here, it's all that has been here, and it's all that will always be here. It's just recycled and presented differently. I said this in my other video. So our suffering is caused by the refusal to accept that things are the way things are at whatever particular moment. We deal with, but why, right? But why? But why? But why? And when we keep asking, but why? But why? But why? We never get to the point of the why, right? Even when we get the why, we still ask, but why? Right? But why? But why? Right? Because we are just failing to accept. But if we would understand that we are not the flesh, therefore, as we are not the flesh, we are privy to the fact that whatever will be happening because it has to happen, and it really does nothing to change anything. And it is okay that it is happening. It's okay that it is happening, right? Then we would start living peaceful and happy lives, because then we would start accepting situations, we would start accepting circumstances, and if there are things we can do to change them, we will do that. We will do the things we must do to change them. But also, if there is nothing we can do, we will just accept that too, and just accept that they are there, and move on with our lives happily and peacefully. So, you know what I'm saying? So, stop the suffering, stop identifying yourself with the flesh, and stop living this life as though things are supposed to be any different. Things will be the way things will be. Right? There is nothing you can do about that. The ocean will move the waves in the direction it chooses to move the waves. It doesn't matter whether you feel like the wave should have actually moved that direction. No, they just will be what the waves will be. The drop in the ocean does not say, oh, but why are we moving this way or not that way, right? The drop in the ocean is just there in the ocean, and it just flows with the rest of the ocean. When the ocean flows, it flows, right? But what you do as a carnally minded person is you become the drop that wants to refuse. When the ocean is flowing that direction, you want to hold on to that direction where you were. You would be asking, why are we flowing there? Why are we not just sitting? Or so you just ask a lot of questions that just do not make sense. So stop the suffering and start accepting situations. Stop the suffering and understand that it's just the nature of creation, right? If you look at my other video, there's a video where I speak about there is no good and there is no bad, right? So because you identify things as that, as it's good or it's bad, that also adds on to your suffering, because when you are caught, you're thinking it's a bad thing that I'm caught. Therefore, why am I caught, right? But if you just identify the caught as it's just a caught, therefore let me just deal with the caught, then there wouldn't be suffering. So stop the suffering, stop identifying yourself with the flesh. You are much greater than the flesh. Greater is He in the flesh than the rest. You know what I'm saying? So stop the suffering. Stop the suffering. Stop the suffering.